皆さんこんにちは。タッチベースの野村です。皆さん調子のほどはいかがでしょうか。僕は2週間くらい前は対 US ドルで111円ぐらいあったのに円高が止まらず、今は対 US ドルで105円までになってしまっている状況にすごい悲しい気持ちです。コロナウイルスで日本からの渡航が制限されたり、オリンピック開催が危ぶまれているのになぜ円が買われているのかよくわからない状況です。誰か詳しい人教えてください。また Facebook グループにて約1ヶ月ほどテストでやっていた Thought of the Week も全く反響がなかったのでこっそりやめました。ちょっとお題がぼんやりしすぎたんですかね。何かアドバイスなどあれば教えていただけると幸いです。悪いニュースだけではなくていいニュースもあります。生後8ヶ月の娘がついにハイハイをマスターし捕まり立ちを習得しつつあります。子供の成長は日進月歩ですね。僕も見習っていきたいと思います。さて、本題のスペンサーに聞く英語ビジネスコミュニケーションシリーズ第3弾をお届けしていきたいと思います。これまでに引き続き英語を学ぶためには英語で学ぶのが一番ということで、言語は英語で配信していきます。今回のテーマは Don't believe the LA New York hype、 アメリカ西海岸と東海岸の違いは単なる誇張です。よく西海岸スタイル、東海岸スタイルなどと言われていますが、ビジネスシーンでの違いはあるのかを彼の経験を踏まえてお話ししていただきました。カナダの西海岸バンクーバーではアジア人の割合が多く、服装もカジュアル、オフィスにはビールがあって、仕事終わりにビーチで夕日を見るというのが夏の過ごし方でしたが、アメリカの方ではどうなのか、またビジネスシーンではどうなのか。では早速本題どうぞ。
Well, today we'll be talking about the two major perceived cultural regions of the United States. Maybe even in Japan, people instinctively know about Los Angeles and New York. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. So here are the key takeaways for this week's podcast. One of the broadest, most popular, distinct U.S. cultural regions in America are the East Coast and West Coast cultures. And when people talk about East Coast and West Coast, generally they are talking about New York and Los Angeles, not the entire East Coast or West Coast, which we'll get to is very large. I have found that media focuses on a young audience to exaggerate the differences between the coasts, and among the older, more mature business community, the differences between these two areas are actually quite small. The U.S. is very big. And these two areas, New York and LA, are so far away from each other that people feel there is a difference between these two. So, getting into it, if you've never been to America, you might have the idea, like I said before, you might have this image of culture in America mainly consisting of two styles, and that is the sort of Hollywood style and the more serious, financially focused New York lifestyle. We can think in LA, people on the beach, at the pool party, they're shooting video, everyone's really cool. Whereas in New York, we have the sort of suit-based culture, all about money. If it's not financially justified, it doesn't do it. Everyone's busy. And if you do a quick search online, you'll find that there's a lot of major media narratives that dominate this cultural landscape. And they like to pit those two cultures sort of against each other, the laid back and creative West Coast and the all business East Coast. You'll find these comparisons on popular culture websites like BuzzFeed, but you'll also find them on exclusively marketing-oriented places such as real estate blogs, company blogs, travel blogs, and other applications. I grew up believing that there was this big difference between the two coasts. And early in my career, and being from the East Coast, I encountered there was a business proposal that came from LA, and I believe I'd quickly identified what I thought was a classic LA business perspective. To give a little more detail, I was on a team that helped evaluate a project proposal. This was actually a proposal for a film. So it was classic, Hollywood. but the submitted proposal was scant on details. It was very light, and it listed the pages that it did include talked about famous connections that the director knew, like famous people, endorsements, likes, and other sort of very surface level marketing points. And it had very little emphasis on revenue generating potential of the film, or the underlying costs of the actual project, who would pay for things. And on top of that, the proposal was very, very optimistic about sales. They believed that this project was just going to be a blockbuster. So I sort of took that in myself to be representative of a classically West Coast, laid back, not very responsible project proposal. But now that I am older and maybe a little bit wiser, and I've worked with different companies from the LA area and also from the West Coast in general, and looking back on that experience, I think that proposal that I worked on was just a bad proposal. I don't think they got funded. We certainly didn't accept their proposal, and I don't think anyone else really would have. Okay. But I went on to work with more companies that were much more responsible, and just a pleasure to work with. So going back to what I was saying, I think it's mostly a pop culture thing, this difference. And I think, US pop culture is pretty popular in the world. So maybe people from other countries also believe that this is true. Whereas now, as a more sort of mature business person, so to speak, I think there's actually very little difference. Well, a marketing proposal in LA will look a lot different than a marketing proposal in New York. We worked for this company called Circus. They were an LA-based company, and they wanted to expand to the East Coast. So they had a small New York office, and they wanted to put a Boston office on the map too. But they sent us their materials and their marketing materials, that they would send anyone. There was like palm trees and like sunny beaches and all kinds of like pool parties was something they were, advertising. They were a company that would help increase the sort of publicity of your event. They were a marketing company essentially. But we got all this stuff. We got these pitch decks that we were supposed to show local retailers and local businesses, but they didn't make any sense for Boston. I mean, no one has it. There's no palm trees in Boston. You know what I mean? There's no, pool. Yeah, some people have pools, but it's not like everyone has a pool like they do in LA. Yeah. That was purely, I don't know, like a semantic thing. Like it was just images, The underlying nature of the business was still very sound. It made sense in LA, and it ultimately would make sense in Boston, but we had to correct that a little bit.
Okay, so execution was a little different.
That's exactly it.
Choice of images and maybe choice of words as well.
Word choice is a little different, but if you're talking about selling everywhere in the US, if you're talking about the country as a whole, your target audience or your target demographic needs to exist everywhere in the US.
It has to be generalized.
Yeah, it has to be general enough so that anyone in the US can relate to it and anyone in the US can buy it, which means the marketing content, the marketing words, as you say, will look mostly the same. Whether it's in San Francisco or New York or Miami or Chicago. Now, if you're selling a super regional, like a region-specific product, it might be different. You might want to pay more attention to that specific area. For example, the state of Maine, which is a little bit north of Massachusetts, it's a big lobster fishing area. So say you're a company in Japan and you make a specific type of lobster trap and you want to sell this idea in the US,
I see.
Obviously, there's no lobster business, I don't think, in LA.
Well, there might be, I don't know.
Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, you'd have to figure that out. That's a project, that's a marketing project. But that's a very sort of, I believe, that's a very industry specific and that's a very region specific market. If you're only selling to the people of Maine then you can get pretty specific. Like, for example, you can tell a joke. Again, and going back to jokes, you can tell a joke that is region specific to Maine. For example, Maine also has its own dialect. So if you really want to focus on that one region, then you can get pretty specific. But for a larger product, an item that almost anyone can appreciate, then your marketing content is going to look very similar wherever it is in the United States. A lot of companies will put local marketing out there, but it gets very complicated very quickly because the East Coast is huge. And this is something I like to point out to anyone coming here, is that any person from New York, any person from Boston will tell you that New York is very close. Oh, New York is just a short drive from Boston. But actually, in reality, it's 3.5 hours driving. But we consider that to be a close distance. Now, if you wanted to drive from Boston, which is on one edge of the coast, all the way down to Florida, which is on the other edge of the coast, that's going to be 22 hours at least of non-stop driving, no bathroom breaks, just driving. So you can imagine in between these little areas, there's a bunch of different cities. And each city, of course, has its own culture, has its own thing. I went to school about 3 hours south of New York City in a city called Baltimore. And that area, that was in the state of Maryland, which had this big, feature called the Chesapeake Bay, which was famous for crabs. Like if you wanted to eat crabs, so there's all this sort of marketing based around that because it was kind of a very famous symbol of Maryland. Now, just over, the next city over was Washington, D.C., which of course has its own everything. And then, going south, then you're in Virginia, then North Carolina, and, it gets pretty expansive if you want to be locally relevant. Maybe for a company like P&G or Nike, they have the budget to sort of do that. Instead of trying to take on the entire country, my recommendation for Japanese companies would be to start local, start small, get really good at marketing in the Boston area, get really good at the Baltimore area. I don't pick, get really good at Texas, just be like the Texas company. Once you generate a lot of local success, then you have sort of local brand that's very strong. And then you can expand to other areas because people are surprised at how expensive it is to market a product in the United States, but you're marketing a product over an entire continent. It's huge, which is why it's really expensive. But if you're just marketing in New York, or if you're just marketing in Atlanta, Georgia, it could be cheaper, and you could have
concentration, like focus.
Yeah, especially for product, consumer-oriented products. For like a piece of software, for example, obviously this doesn't apply.
How do you pick the right state to go with?
Yeah, market research definitely has to come first. Different regions of the United States, if you look carefully, are better at some things than others.
Right.
And I know that's super vague, but you learn it on a case by case. You may not know this, but almost all banking transactions in the United States, so when you process a payment or anything like that, it goes through this city called Omaha in Nebraska.
Okay, I've never heard of it. Omaha.
Yeah, no, it's a very sort of obscure city. There's tech and then there's fintech, right? And if you have a piece of financial technology, you might get some traction in the Bay Area, in San Francisco area, but maybe Omaha, is the right city for you to really plant down. If you have a product that makes banking transactions easier, you might, have a chunk of money, say $100,000 to spend in the United States. You might assume that San Francisco is the best place to do that. You might get an office there, you might even plane trips and buying people dinner and going to conferences, quickly the money can go away. And maybe you've spent all this time in San Francisco, trying to make connections, but it's just not working. Everyone, has a social media business that they're trying to sell, but there's no fintech isn't working and you can't figure out why. well, maybe that's because it's actually not there. Everyone who's in that business is in another city. So making sure you identify these sort of regionalizations can save you a lot of money